At the start of the summer of 1914, World War I broke out and young men from all over Britain were called up to fight for their country. There isn't any accurate record of how many British served in what was one of the largest wars in history, but it is believed to have been somewhere between 6 and 7 million men. The battalions of men who were unlucky enough to be posted to the front line had to endure rat-infested trenches, constant enemy fire, terrible illnesses and daily deaths of fellow soldiers, and in many cases, friends. Among these men lived 2 women whose unfounded bravery and desire to help others soon made them the most famous women in the war. Elsie Knocker, a trained nurse from Exeter, and her friend Mary Chisholm met at a motorcycle club in Bournemouth, where they raced between 1912 and 1914, when the war broke out. Within a month, they had packed their bags and were on the Western Front in Belgium to do their bit. To find out more, I decided to pack my bags too and head to Belgium to meet up with local historian and teacher Patrick Van Leene, who kindly agreed to talk to me about Elsie and Mary's life there.
Well, it all started in August 1914, the 4th of August to be precise, when the Germans invaded Belgium. And the British wanted to help Belgium countering that invasion, because Belgium was neutral. In London there was a doctor, a Scottish doctor, Hector Munro, psychiatrist, who had studied with Freud in Austria, and who had the crazy plan to bring together 5 women and 5 men and organize a flying ambulance unit. Dr. Hector Munro's Flying Ambulance Corps, it was to be named. And he selected 5 women who could drive cars and who had, if possible, some experience in nursing. Selected 5 men, 2 of them drivers, and they set out for Belgium. Elsie drove one of those ambulances and very soon realized that bringing the soldiers in from the front line in Dixmude back to Veurne, say something like 20 miles, killed quite a number of them, because the roads were very bad. The ambulances at that time were not too good too, and there was the wounds were so terrible that they in fact should have been treated right away, and now the soldiers had to wait for a number of hours before they got to the hospital in Veurne and could get saved. So they thought that they better put up an aid post right behind the firing line, right behind the front line. They were shelled out by the Germans from their first aid post quite early at the end of 1914, and then they had they opened up a new post further down the road. That's the post number 2, which was there also for a year or so, and then that was destroyed too. And then they moved to the last cellar house, the last post, which was the last house in the village on the way to Veurne. So you realize that living the life they did in Perveze was not an everyday life. It was full of risks which none of us would take nowadays, or even think of taking. They did, and they did that for Belgium, for the Belgian people, for the Belgian soldiers.
After speaking with Patrick, he took me to see the front line, now marked by a footpath running for miles along the front of Perveze. Now, however, 90 years on, you wouldn't have thought that this rather quaint little town was once nothing but an expanse of sandbags and rubble, although there was the odd reminder that this was home to thousands of troops fighting for their country. Ensign Paul Knocker, now aged 78, explains why their work played such a vital role in the constant struggle to win the war.
It became very clear that the immediate treatment of the wounded from the trenches, giving them warmth and care, overcame the problem of shock and trauma after they'd been wounded. But of course they treated the wounds as well, and they prepared them for the journey back to the hospital. But there's no doubt at all that this saved thousands of lives over the period of 3 years when they were established on the front line. It's worth just reading a little note from a recent report in the newspapers, which came from the Journal of the Royal Army Medical Corps, which pointed out that British troops were taking longer to get to a field hospital than it took the Americans in Vietnam. 2 hours delay in Iraq has become 7 hours in Helmand. This often fatal delay is almost entirely due to the lack of equipment and the lack of dressing stations on the front line. This is 100 years later, after the events in 1914.
They had first-hand experience of numerous men dying of shock in the back of their vehicles on the way to the hospitals miles away from the front. Seeing this, they took it upon themselves to set up their own first aid posts 100 yards from the front, in the village of Pervyse. They used whatever they could to make makeshift shelters for the wounded men to be brought back and treated only minutes from being injured, hugely increasing their chances of recovery.
I think one of the most moving experiences in my life has been the family visit to Pervyse just a few years ago, when Patrick Van Leen took us to this cellar, which still exists exactly as it was. The house has been rebuilt, but there is this cellar, 10 foot by 12 foot, which is where Elsie and Marie lived and treated the wounded in 1914 and 15. And it's the most emotional experience to go down into that cellar and see where this action took place.
Elsie and Marie risked their lives daily to save wounded men under constant bombardment for months at a time. When there was a lull in the fighting, the women would come back and tour the UK on their infamous motorcycle and sidecar to raise money to help fund their post in Pervyse. This remarkable effort from the two women didn't go unnoticed by the once unsupportive army officials, and they were recognised for their bravery.
Both Elsie and Marie were awarded a number of decorations for their amazing work on the front line. The final incident, in addition to helping the soldiers, was the rescue of a pilot who was shot down in no man's land, and they both went out to rescue him and save his life. And that resulted in the immediate and exceptional award of the military medal to both the girls.
News of their courage soon spread back to England, and the Angels of Pervyse, as they were known, became national heroes. Journalists and photographers told their story, and royals and VIPs visited them to praise them for their work.
The most dangerous place in Pervyse, without any doubt, during the First World War was Suicide Corner. It was named that way by Elsie and Mary because it was crossroads where all the supplies and all the soldiers passed by in the morning and at night when they were relieved from the trenches, from their duties, and the Germans knew that, and they had their artillery pointed at that place. So it was shelled constantly, but everybody had to pass across that crossroads sooner or later. On the corner of it was a pub, and it got a funny name after all. It was called Paradise. So it's paradise on Suicide Corner. And from Suicide Corner, there was a road leading to Ramskapelle. It's another little village down the front line, and Mary and Elsie often had to go to Ramskapelle to collect 200 soldiers over there. It was a long, straight road alongside the front line, say something like 30 feet from the front line, and they had to drive it to negotiate it every day. The Germans knew that, and whenever they saw that ambulance coming down from Purvese to Ramskapelle, they pointed one of their guns at it, and they started shooting by way of as a game, you know. And Mary Chisholm very much liked it, that little game with the Germans, because then she accelerated or she stopped so that the Germans would miss their target. And they never hit her, so it worked every single time.
Unfortunately, Elsie's and Mari's luck did in the end run out, and they were victims of a horrifying attack.
They too were caught out by the gas attack in 1918, which arsenic and mustard gas,
well, knocked them out. A first gas shell brought the two to a hospital, and Elsie Knocker was quite heavy. I don't know how to say that in English, you know. She was badly hurt by that gas, so she never returned. She ended up in a hospital in London and never returned to Purvese.
Elsie and Mari lived in a time where women's voices weren't really heard when it came to important matters. But in times of need, they disregarded their orders from their male superiors and did what they knew needed to be done. They were the angels of Purvese, the angels who came for those who thought no one would.